I had spent 6 years making sure Suleiman Vance never knew how I felt about him. 6 years of swallowing his name every time my brother said it. 6 years of finding reasons to leave a room the moment he walked into it. I thought distance was armor. I thought if I never said the words out loud, they couldn't ruin anything: his friendship with my brother, my family, the last piece of my father's legacy I had left to protect. Then the biggest storm in 40 years closed every road off the island, and my brother called to say Sully was already on the ferry, already coming, already 12 hours from being trapped with me in a lighthouse with no signal and nowhere to hide. I told myself I could survive 3 days alone with him. I was wrong about almost everything that week: about the storm, about my brother, about the secret Sully I had been keeping just as carefully as I'd been keeping mine. But what happened next changed my life forever. The lighthouse at Averill Point had not held a working lamp in 11 years, but Idris Calloway kept it standing the way other men kept graves clean. He climbed the spiral stairs every morning before the gulls woke, past the brass fixtures his father had polished until the day he died, past the logbooks nobody read anymore, up to the lantern room where the glass was clouded with salt and the view was the only thing on the island that never changed. From here he could see the whole curve of the bay, the black rocks the fishermen called the Widow's Teeth, and, on a clear day, the mainland ferry cutting a white seam through the water. Today there was no clear day. The sky over the strait had the color of a bruise, and the radio had been repeating the same warning since dawn. Storm system intensifying. All non-essential travel to island communities strongly discouraged. Ferry service suspended after the 2 o'clock crossing. Idris turned the radio down and told himself it didn't matter, because nobody was coming. Then his phone buzzed against the counter, and his brother's name filled the screen, and something in Idris's chest tightened before he'd even answered. "Please tell me you're not still on the mainland," Idris said, by way of hello. "I'm not," Mateo said. "I'm in Seattle till Thursday, remember? Conference." A pause, the particular pause his brother used before saying something he already knew would be unwelcome. "But Sully's not. He caught the 2 o'clock ferry an hour ago. He's coming to check on the bird count before the storm hits. I told him you could use the company." Idris closed his eyes. Below him, gulls screamed against the wind like they already knew. "You didn't think to ask me first. Would you have said yes?" "No. That's why I didn't ask." Mateo's voice softened, the way it always did when he was trying to sound casual about something that wasn't. "Edie, it's been 4 months since Dad. You're alone out there with a lighthouse that doesn't even light up anymore. Let somebody keep you company for 3 days. It's Sully. You've known him since you were 19. That's the problem," Idris thought, but didn't say it. He hung up and stood very still in the kitchen, listening to the wind pick up outside, and understood, with the flat calm of a man watching a wave rise before it breaks, that there was no way now to stop what was coming. Suleiman Vance had been an ornithologist for 6 years, and in that time he had learned that storms terrified almost everyone except the birds, who seemed to understand something about survival that people had long since unlearned. Petrels rode the wind instead of fighting it. Gulls found the leeward cliffs before the barometer even dropped. There was a lesson in that, Sully thought, though he had never quite managed to apply it to his own life. He'd told Mateo he was coming out to finish the storm displacement bird count before the weather turned. That part was true. He had not told Mateo the other reason: that when his friend had mentioned, almost in passing, that Idris had been alone at the lighthouse since the funeral, something in Sully's chest had gone very quiet and very certain, and he had bought the ferry ticket before he let himself think too hard about why. He had known Idris for 6 years. He had loved him, quietly and without permission, for almost that long. The ferry crossing was rough enough that half the passengers spent it gripping the rails, faces green, but Sully stood at the bow with his camera bag against his chest and watched Averill Point rise out of the grey water, white tower, black rocks, and the small dark figure standing at the end of the dock like he'd been carved there. Idris hadn't come to welcome him. He'd come to tell him to turn around. Sully smiled anyway, because some habits were older than good sense. "You should go back," Idris said, before Sully had even set his bag down on the dock. "Last ferry's at 2. If you leave now you'll make it. Good afternoon to you too." "I'm serious, Sully. The forecast has this thing at Category 3 by tonight. You do not want to be stuck out here." Sulei looked past him, up at the lighthouse, its white paint gray under the darkening sky, and something in his expression made Idris's argument falter before he could finish it. "I know exactly what I don't want," Sulei said quietly. "Believe me." He didn't explain what he meant. Idris didn't ask. They stood there a moment too long, the wind picking up strands of Idris's hair and throwing them across his face, and then Sulei hefted his bag onto his shoulder and started up the path toward the house, leaving Idris no choice but to follow or stand alone on the dock arguing with the weather. The lighthouse keeper's cottage sat at the base of the tower, 3 rooms and a kitchen that still smelled faintly of his father's pipe tobacco no matter how many times Idris scrubbed the walls. He'd left Sulei's old room, the one he used to sleep in during summer visits, back when Mateo brought him out every June exactly as it had always been. He told himself that was practicality, not sentiment. By 4 o'clock the windows were rattling in their frames and the sea had gone the color of iron. By 5, the last ferry crossing was cancelled outright, an announcement Sulei relayed from his phone with the calm of a man reading out a grocery list. "Well," he said, setting the phone face down on the table. "Looks like it's just us." Idris didn't answer right away. He was watching the storm build over the water, the way the whole bay seemed to be holding its breath, and thinking that he had spent 6 years building careful distance between himself and this man, brick by brick, and the storm had just taken a wrecking ball to every wall in one afternoon. "I'll take the couch," he said finally. "I didn't ask you to." "I know." Idris turned from the window. "I'm telling you anyway." Something flickered across Sulei's face, amusement, maybe, or something gentler that Idris didn't let himself look at too closely, and then he simply nodded and went to find the bird logs, and the strange, charged quiet of the evening settled over the cottage like the first hour of a held breath. They ate dinner by lamplight because the power flickered twice within the hour and Idris didn't trust it to last. Canned soup, bread gone slightly stale, and a silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable so much as loaded, the kind of quiet that came from two people carefully not saying several things at once. "You didn't come out here for the birds," Idris said eventually. It wasn't an accusation. It came out softer than he meant it to. Sulei set down his spoon. Outside, the wind found a gap in the old window frame and moaned through it, low and constant. "I did, actually. Storm displacement's a real research question. Petrels get pushed miles off course in weather like this, sometimes strand themselves on rocks they'd never normally land on." He paused. "But no. That's not the only reason." "Then what is?" Sulei looked at him for a long moment, and Idris felt that look land somewhere under his ribs, the way it always had, the way he'd spent 6 years pretending it didn't. "Mateo told me you haven't been sleeping," Sulei said. "That you've barely left this island since the funeral. That you talk to the birds more than you talk to actual people." A small, careful smile. "I wanted to see for myself that you were okay." "I'm fine." "You're standing in a condemned lighthouse in a Category 3 storm rather than admit you might want company." "I don't think fine is the word I'd reach for." Idris opened his mouth to argue and found, to his own irritation, that he didn't have one ready. He looked down at the table instead, at the grain of the old wood his father had built with his own hands, and felt something in his chest crack open half an inch. "He was supposed to teach me how to run this place for another 20 years, Idris said quietly. "Not 4 months. I wasn't ready." "I know." Sulei's voice had gone very gentle. "I'm sorry, Edie. I should have come sooner. You didn't need to come at all." "I wanted to. A beat. I've wanted to for a while, actually. I just didn't have a good enough excuse until the birds gave me one." Idris looked up sharply, and for one unguarded second something passed between them that neither of them named, too raw, too sudden, too close to a truth that 6 years of careful distance had never quite managed to bury. Then the lights flickered again, this time going out entirely, and the moment dissolved into darkness and the scrape of a chair as Sulei went to find the candles. Neither of them mentioned it again that night. But Idris lay awake on the couch a long time, listening to the storm and to the quiet sounds of Sulei moving in the next room, and understood that something in him had shifted that would not shift back. The storm did not let up by morning. If anything, it had sharpened, the wind now carrying a high, thin scream through the lighthouse's old iron stairs, and the sea beyond the widow's teeth had turned into something that looked less like water than like a living, furious thing. Sulei spent the morning at the lantern room window with his camera and binoculars, cataloging the storm-battered birds that limped onto the rocks below, a leech's storm petrel, half a dozen exhausted gulls, once a young albatross so far from its usual range that Sulei actually laughed out loud in surprise, a sound that startled Idris more than the thunder had. "You really love this," Idris said, climbing the stairs with 2 mugs of coffee that had gone lukewarm somewhere around the 80th step. "I really do." Sulei accepted the mug without looking away from the glass. "There's something about watching a creature survive something that should have killed it. Makes you believe in resilience again." "Is that a metaphor?" "Only if you want it to be." Idris huffed something that was almost a laugh, and for a while they simply stood together at the glass, shoulders nearly touching, watching the storm do its violent work on the water below. It was, Idris thought, the closest he had felt to peace in 4 months. It was Sulei who broke the quiet. "Can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer." "Okay. Why did you stop coming to Mateo's things? Birthdays, the New Year's thing, all of it. You used to come to everything. Then about 6 years ago you just stopped." Idris's grip tightened slightly on his mug. 6 years. He'd counted the same number more times than he wanted to admit. "Dad needed help with the lighthouse," he said. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It also wasn't the truth. Edie Sulei's voice was quiet, careful, the voice of a man setting something down gently because he suspected it might break. "You could have brought him with you. You never even tried. It wasn't about the lighthouse." The words were out before Idris could stop them, and he felt his own pulse jump in his throat, felt the sudden, terrifying nearness of a truth he had spent 6 years keeping buried under careful distance in cancelled visits and 100 small excuses. Sulei had gone very still beside him, watching him now instead of the birds, and Idris understood that there was no version of this conversation where he could take the sentence back. "Then what was it about?" Sulei asked. Below them, the sea broke against the widow's teeth hard enough to send spray 30 feet into the air, and the whole tower seemed to shudder with it, and Idris, coward that he'd been for 6 long years, reached for the oldest excuse he had. "I should check the generator," he said, and left Sulei standing alone in the lantern room with a question that would not go away. He did not, in fact, check the generator. He stood in the dark stairwell for a long time instead, forehead against the cool stone, listening to his own heartbeat compete with the storm. It wasn't about the lighthouse. He'd said it. Out loud. To Sulei's face. 6 years of careful architecture, and one storm had knocked the whole thing down in under a minute. By the time he made himself go back downstairs, the light outside had gone the strange yellow-green of a storm nearing its worst, and he found Sulei in the kitchen, not looking at him, methodically checking the seals on the windows like a man giving his hands something to do so his mind wouldn't wander somewhere dangerous. "I owe you an explanation," Idris said. "You don't owe me anything." Sulei didn't turn around. "I shouldn't have pushed." "You didn't push. I've just been running from the answer for 6 years and you happened to be standing where I ran into the wall." That got Sulei to turn around. His expression was carefully neutral in the way Idris had learned, over the years, meant he was hiding something enormous behind it. "My father used to say the sea doesn't care how carefully you plan your course," Idris said. "You can chart every mile of it and it'll still take you somewhere you didn't intend to go." He made himself meet Sulei's eyes. "I stopped coming around because being near you and not being able to say anything was worse than not seeing you at all. You were my brother's best friend. You still are. I didn't think there was a version of the truth that didn't cost me both of you." The silence that followed was so complete that Idris could hear the storm shutters groaning against their hinges 2 rooms away. "Idris." Sulei's voice had gone rough. "Do you have any idea how long I've been waiting for you to say something like that?" "What?" "I didn't come out here for the birds," Sulei said again, and this time there was no careful evasion in it at all. "I came because Mateo told me you were alone, and because I have spent 6 years finding excuses to be near you and hating myself a little every time, because you'd go quiet and leave the room and I was so sure that it was because you couldn't stand me." "I couldn't stand how much I wanted you," Idris said. "There's a difference. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Sulei crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and Idris didn't step back, and the space between 6 years of silence closed all at once, gently, like a door easing shut against a wind that had finally stopped trying to force its way through. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But Sulei's hand came up to rest against the side of Idris's face, thumb tracing the line of his jaw, and Idris turned into the touch like something that had been cold for a very long time finally finding warmth, and outside the storm screamed on, indifferent to the small, quiet miracle happening inside the lighthouse. The confession did not undo 6 years of caution in a single afternoon. If anything, it made the air between them more charged. Every accidental touch weighted with everything unsaid before, every glance held a half-second too long. They ate dinner closer together than the table required. Sulei told stories about fieldwork in Alaska, about a puffin colony that had adopted him as a minor deity for 3 weeks because he kept the foxes away, and Idris found himself laughing in a way that felt unfamiliar in his own chest, like a muscle he hadn't used in months. "Can I tell you something you're not going to like?" Sulei said, once the plates were cleared. Idris's stomach dropped slightly. "That's an ominous way to start. Mateo knows about how I feel." "He's known for almost a year." Idris went very still. "He never said anything. He was waiting for one of us to be brave enough to say it first." Sulei's mouth curved, rueful. "He told me, and I quote, that watching the two of us dance around each other was exhausting to witness and he wasn't going to do our confessing for us. He set this up." Idris felt something between betrayal and disbelief rising in his chest. The storm, the timing, did he know the ferry would get cancelled? He checked the forecast before he called me. "I only found that out after I was already on the boat." Sulei held up both hands, half laughing, half apologetic. In his defense, he thought we'd have figured it out on our own days ago. He didn't expect either of us to be quite this stubborn. Idris put his face in his hands, half a laugh and half a groan escaping him. "My own brother, playing matchmaker with a hurricane. To be fair, it worked. It absolutely did not have to almost drown me in the process. But there was no real anger in it, only the strange, dizzy relief of watching 6 years of careful hiding collapse into something that had, apparently, been an open secret to everyone except the 2 people it belonged to." Idris looked at Sulei across the small kitchen table, lamplight flickering gold across his face, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since the day his father died, maybe longer. "I still don't forgive him," he said. "But I suppose I understand him. Generous of you. Don't get used to it." Sulei reached across the table and took his hand, and neither of them pulled away this time, and outside the wind screamed on, but for the first time in 4 months, Idris didn't feel like he was facing it alone. The storm reached its peak just after midnight, and it was the sound of tearing metal that woke them both, the old weather vane on the lantern room roof finally giving way to a gust strong enough to rip it from its mount. Idris was on his feet before he was fully awake, adrenaline sharpening everything into hard focus. "The equipment," he said. "Your cameras, the recording gear, it's all still set up by the north window. If that vane's coming loose, the whole housing could go." "Idris, wait." But he was already moving, already halfway up the spiral stairs with a flashlight in hand, driven by the same stubborn instinct that had kept this lighthouse standing for 11 years after it stopped being useful, the refusal to let one more piece of his father's legacy be taken by something he couldn't control. The lantern room, when he reached it, was chaos, rain driving sideways through a crack in the old housing, wind screaming through the gap where the vane had torn free. Papers and equipment scattered across the floor. Idris grabbed for Sulei's camera bag just as a gust slammed the loose section of housing hard enough to send a shard of old glass skittering past his head. "Idris!" Sulei's voice, close behind him now, edged with a fear Idris had never heard in it before. "Get away from the window, now. I've almost got it. I don't care about the camera." The words came out cracked, raw, and it was that, not the storm, not the danger, that made Idris finally turn around. Sulei's face in the flashlight beam was stricken in a way that had nothing to do with equipment. "I watched a colleague die in a storm exactly like this one. 3 years ago, on a research platform off on Alaska. He went back for a data drive." "A data drive, Idris? I am not doing this again. Please." Please just come away from the glass. Idris let go of the bag. He crossed the room and pulled Sulei into his arms instead, both of them soaked through, the wind howling around the broken housing, and held on because there was nothing else in that moment that mattered more than the man shaking against his chest. I'm here, Idris said, into his hair. I'm not going anywhere. I'm sorry. They didn't try to save the equipment. They retreated down the stairs together, sealed the lantern room door behind them, and sat on the floor of the stairwell, wrapped in a single blanket Sulei had grabbed on the way, listening to the storm finish what it had started 3 floors above them. I should have told you about Marcus sooner, Sulei said, once his breathing had steadied. That's the wound I don't talk about. Losing him. It's part of why I never let myself want anything too much. Wanting people is how you lose them. You didn't lose me tonight. I know. Sulei's hand found his in the dark. I think that's what scared me more than the storm did. Dawn came gray and exhausted, the storm finally spending itself into a steady, ordinary rain. They emerged from the stairwell stiff and salt damp to find the lantern room housing cracked but standing, most of the equipment salvageable, the weather vane lying twisted on the rocks below like something the sea had spat back out. Over breakfast, the last of the bread, toasted over a camp stove because the power still hadn't returned, Sulei was quieter than Idris had yet seen him, turning his mug slowly between his hands. I need to tell you something, he said finally. And I need you to actually hear it, not just brace for it. Okay. There's a permanent research position opening at the Fisheries Institute. Coastal Seabird Monitoring, 3-year contract, based out of Astoria. He didn't look up. I was going to apply before any of this. Before I understood what I actually wanted. It would mean I'm not out in the field 12 months a year anymore. It would mean I'm 4 hours from here instead of scattered across 3 time zones. Idris felt something in his chest lift, cautious and unfamiliar. That sounds like good news. It is. I think it is. Sulei finally met his eyes. But I wanted to ask you something first, because I don't want to build a life 4 hours from you and assume that's what you want too. I know this lighthouse is your whole world right now. I know you're still grieving your father, and I'm not asking you to hand me an answer to something enormous 3 days after finally admitting how you feel. Sulei. I just need to know if there's a version of this you actually want. Not the version where I show up during hurricanes and disappear for months. A real one. Idris was quiet for a long moment, looking out the rain-streaked window at the tower his father had built his whole life around, at the sea that had taken so much and given, in the end, this one unexpected thing back. My father spent 30 years keeping a light burning for ships that mostly didn't need it anymore, he said slowly. I used to think that was devotion. Lately I've started thinking it might have been fear of what happens if you stop tending something and it turns out you don't know how to live without the tending. He looked back at Sulei. I don't want to keep this place lit out of fear anymore. I want a reason that isn't grief. Is that a yes? That's a yes, Idris said, and reached across the small space between them, and this time, when Sulei kissed him, there was no storm outside loud enough to make either of them look away. The ferry resumed service 3 days later, and Mateo was on the first crossing out, arriving on the dock with an expression that was equal parts smug and relieved, as though he'd personally engineered the entire hurricane. You're both alive, he said. And he gestured vaguely between them, holding hands. I'm going to need someone to confirm I'm not hallucinating. You knew, Idris said, arms crossed, doing his best to look stern and failing badly. You checked the forecast before you called him. I checked the forecast, Mateo agreed, entirely unrepentant, because I love you both too much to watch you keep missing each other by inches for 1 more year. Sue me. I might. You won't. You're too busy being happy. Mateo's grin softened into something more sincere as he looked between them. You are, though. Happy. Both of you. I haven't seen that on your face since before Dad. He cleared his throat, suddenly a little rough. It's good, Edie. It's really good. They stood on the dock together as the ferry unloaded, the 3 of them, the sea calm now, scrubbed clean by the storm into something almost gentle. Idris looked up at the lighthouse, his father's lighthouse, still standing, weather vane bent but the tower itself unbroken, and understood that some things could survive a storm not by refusing to be touched by it, but by letting themselves be changed. 6 months later, the lighthouse at Averill Point had a working light again. It wasn't strictly necessary, modern ships didn't need it the way they once had, but Idris had spent the winter rewiring the old lamp anyway, and Sulei, 4 hours away now instead of scattered across the world, drove out every second weekend to help, hands stained with the same grease and salt that had once belonged only to Idris's father. On the night they finally switched it on, the two of them climbed the spiral stairs together and stood in the lantern room where 6 years of silence had finally broken open, and watched the beam sweep out across the dark water for the first time in over a decade. "Your father would like this," Sulei said quietly. The light coming back on. "Not for the ships. For you." "He'd like you," Idris said. "Took him one hurricane and my brother meddling with a weather app to get it, but he'd have liked you a lot." Sulei laughed, and pulled him close, and the light kept turning above them, steady and sure, casting its slow gold circle out over the water, no longer a monument to what had been lost, but a promise, however small, of everything that had finally, after all that careful and unnecessary distance, been found. Somewhere below them, in the last of the wind off the water, a lone petrel rode the currents home. It did not fight the storm. It simply let the wind carry it exactly where it needed to go.